Okay, wonderful. So thank you all for joining today. It's been a busy event season as expected for the CJC and I think the rest of the university. We've had a bunch of events already discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict. We had a book talk from Yaakov Katz, a former editor of the Jerusalem Post, who just wrote a book called While Israel Slept about the military failure on October 7th. We still have some books if students are interested. We still have some books available, so please come by the CJC, the lounge, and grab a copy if you're interested. There are a few left. And of course, we just had a big conference together with the Berkeley Center. And interestingly, a little bit according to on our topic, which we'll get to in a second, and the American Jewish Committee on the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, Vatican II, and the implications for Catholic Jewish relations, and of course, Catholic Muslim Catholic Dharmic tradition relations as well. But anyway, it's been an incredibly busy time, and we're incredibly grateful to welcome back, I believe, to Georgetown, although maybe not this campus.
Not this campus, right? Yeah.
Necessarily, but to welcome. Shushan is, among other things, an affiliate with us at the senior research affiliate with the CJC, and will be an adjunct with us next semester, and will actually be teaching on this topic. We can talk a little bit more about your course. Of course, your background, most immediately, you were a senior policy advisor for J Street up until about how long?
The end of 2024.
At the end of 2024. You also taught at William and Mary and your background is, of course, in Middle East studies, I believe. Is that the
I'm a Middle East political scientist.
Middle East political science? And of course, did her postdoc fellowship at Georgetown in Doha, in Qatar, on campus there. So welcome back to Georgetown, and welcome to the Hilltop campus. I think today, and I should say, of course, your educational background, incredibly impressive, from Harvard to Oxford to Yale. And we're incredibly grateful to have you here. And look forward to hearing from you. Today, as advertised, we're going to be discussing the politics of the Jewish American community since October 7th. I think this is in some ways a little bit of a departure for us at the CJC, because I think while we're much more comfortable talking about Israel, about the Israeli politics, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict in many different dimensions, we don't often get a chance to really talk about the implications for US politics, and in particular for domestic politics. Not that that's off limits by any stretch, but again, it's not something that we talk about very often. So again, really looking forward to this. I think just to start, and we'll give you a chance to say hello, and after this introduction, I think maybe what would be most interesting is for us to have a conversation and then open it up to the audience for Q&A towards the end. But perhaps as we start and as we ask you, the sort of generally broad question about your understanding of Jewish American politics and how they've shifted since October 7th with the ongoing war in Gaza and all of its dimensions, and worrying dimensions, to be honest. Maybe you could help situate the sort of, not necessarily the alphabet soup of organizations, related to Jewish American politics, but what we understand by Jewish American politics. Yourself having worked with J Street and the sort of crossover Israel advocacy to support for Israel to Jewish American politics and what all of that means, maybe in the context. I'm sorry, I'm giving you a lot, and we can offer several courses on this topic, and certainly you can write several books on this.
Yes.
But again, with these softball questions here to you, maybe I'll hand it over to you, and we can start the conversation. Thank you, Deb.
Awesome. Well, I'm super happy to be here, and very excited to take up an affiliation with the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown. Just happy to be back at Georgetown now at the Hilltop campus here in DC. And the issue of Jewish American politics since October 7th of 2023, very near to 2 years ago, is something that so many of us have lived. I'm very much looking forward to getting a chance to talk with all of you and hear what your questions are and hear your experiences and have a discussion. So, Jonathan and I will kind of kick things off a little bit, but I'm very interested to hear from all of you as well. And one of the things that I'll just say, I'm very excited about coming back to, and teaching at Georgetown next semester. I kicked off my career as an academic and taught for 10 years at the College of William and Mary. I was the Middle East politics specialist in the government department there at W&M. And it's been, so I left William and Mary almost 10 years ago, moved up to the DC area, and had a bit of a career change, went from teaching Middle East politics to engaging in policy and trying to shape the policy of the U.S. government in to my mind, what would be a much sounder manner vis-a-vis U.S. policy on the Middle East, on Israel-Palestine specifically. And so it's been quite a while since I've had a chance to be in the classroom. And I know what an intense time this has been on campuses, in the last 2 years. And so I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to get to be with students again, in part just because I love teaching, but also because as a Jewish American who's not actually on a college campus, man, do you hear a lot about what happens on college campuses through all different sort of filters. And I am very much looking forward to having an opportunity to actually be with students and get to be together in a classroom again here at Georgetown. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. And I would just say, as you spoke about CJC focusing more on the Middle East and Israel, Palestine, and the interesting thing is that is also my academic background, and that's what I've taught in the past. And then, came up to DC, something not quite a decade ago, and had a real crash course education in American politics, where Jewish Americans fit in, how U.S. foreign policy gets made, all of that sort of stuff, which I've learned more as a practitioner than as an academic. And so I'm really looking forward to getting to, share some of what I've learned as a practitioner and also as an academic as well. Okay. To your question about Jewish American politics, I mean, there's a few ways that we could think about this. And one of the things that was one of my responsibilities when I was at J Street was to be our representative to the diplomatic community. And that was a really fun thing to do, to teach foreign diplomats who were trying to get their brains around American politics, around Israel-Palestine, about the Jewish American community. And so, the first thing to do, right, is to kind of just situate American Jews in terms of American politics before we even get to any institutions or organizations or whatever, right? So if you take a snapshot of the Jewish American community in U.S. politics, and here I'm going to be giving a few numbers from Pew, which did this poll back in 2021. And what they found was that politically, 71% of Jewish Americans identified as Democrats and 26% as Republicans, right? This is something that has been fairly consistent in American politics, where you have Jewish Americans as a consistent base of support for the Democratic Party. In fact, one of the most consistent among all demographic groups. The only one that really is up in the same sphere would be African Americans in terms of levels of support for the Democratic Party. Now, as I said, there is a segment of the Jewish American community that supports the Republican Party. That is absolutely true. It's about a quarter, right? Roughly a quarter of the Jewish American community. But one thing I think that is really interesting and important to know is about the demographics of the community and how it maps onto the politics. And so, if you think of Jewish Americans in the various denominational streams, or those who don't identify with a denomination, that helps to illuminate things a little bit. So if you look at Orthodox Jews, their politics are very different from the rest of the Jewish American community. In fact, it's almost the flip, right, of what I gave you in terms of the overall picture of the Jewish community. Orthodox Jews, 75% support the Republican Party and only 20% support Democrats, right? Well, what's interesting, if you know anything about the Jewish American community, you probably know that the Orthodox portion of the Jewish American community is growing, right? And that's merely a demographic issue, right? Because Orthodox Jews tend to have more children than Jews who identify either as conservative or reform or don't identify with any stream, right? So there are interesting changes that are coming down the pike that we need to be thinking about, or that I think about in terms of the politics. One thing that's really interesting, and a subject that I want to get to, is the question of polarization in the Jewish American community. But just going from this demographic point for just a moment, it helps to illuminate and help us to understand the polarization that's happening. If you look at Jews who are in the demographic of the majority of people in this room, which is 18 to 29, they look very different from the few folks who are sort of concentrated over here, who are in, sorry to call you folks out, an older age demographic. Things look really, really different. And so, for example, for Jewish Americans who are 65 years of age and older, only 3% are Orthodox Jewish. Really small percentage. Do you know what it is for 18 to 29-year-olds? 17%, right? So that is growing at a very strong rate. And presumably, right, if the partisan affiliation stays consistent, that is going to have some knock-on effects down the line. There's another segment of the Jewish American population that's growing among younger Americans, and that is Jews who identify as ethnically Jewish, but don't consider themselves religiously Jewish, right? That is also growing. So you have the Orthodox Jewish population growing substantially, and also those who don't see themselves as religiously Jewish. And this is for those of us who are Jewish Americans, like, this makes sense. We know that there are plenty of Jewish people who are ethnically Jewish, culturally Jewish, but not religiously Jewish. For if there are folks in the room who are not Jewish, this may be really weird to you. But there are plenty of those folks. And so for the 65 and older crowd, right, 70% identify as either reform or conservative, right? Those are the two, other than Orthodox, these are the two big pillars of the Jewish community, right? The Reform and conservative movements, right? But that drops down very substantially among 18 to 29-year-olds. Only 40% consider themselves to be Reform or conservative, right? Whereas 40%, an equal number, consider themselves to be Jews of no religion, right? And then the remaining 17% see themselves as, or, classify themselves as Orthodox Jewish. So really big demographic shifts that are happening within the Jewish community that are going to impact on our politics. And we haven't even talked about October 7th yet, right? We haven't even gotten it. And then you throw that in and, so this is sort of like the background music that we're talking about now that has, that exists apart from October 7th. And we'll get to October 7th. I think before we do, the other thing that I'll just mention, since you asked about sort of the institutions and the alphabet soup, especially given that, we are living here in DC, we probably know more perhaps about, all of the organizations here in DC that claim in one way or another, stake a claim to representing the Jewish American community. And I've worked actually for two of those organizations. We mentioned J Street. I also worked for an organization before that called Americans for Peace Now, which has since changed its name to something else. But both of those are kind of progressive Israel, consider themselves pro-Israel, pro-peace kinds of organizations. So you have organizations like that who might, another term that you might use for them is liberal Zionist. I throw that out there because I know you've mentioned that term and we might get to that term. But you have also, of course, organizations that are far older and more established who are to the right of those organizations politically, right? And that would include any number of organizations, like you mentioned already, the AJC would be one of those organizations that is much older, bigger, better financed, more conservative politically. They would see themselves as centrist politically, I'm sure. Then you have other organizations like AIPAC, which is, of course, extremely well known and has played an outsized role in American politics. And J Street, in many ways, the organization that I worked for, was established to be the antidote to AIPAC, if I were to put it that way. And then you have other organizations. One that I think is important to talk about, and we may get to this, is the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. Right. So there are any number of these big, and then there's another organization that's worth noting as well, called the Conference of Presidents, which was created back under the Eisenhower administration. The story is that President Eisenhower said, you know what, I am sick and tired anytime that I want to go and talk to the Jewish American community about anything. I got to talk to a million different organizations, and this is exhausting. So do me a favor and get yourselves organized and have somebody who can come and talk to me. And that was the beginning of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. And they kind of act as the gatekeepers. And they are also politically to the right, which, as you'll note, doesn't map onto where Jewish Americans are as a whole, right? You have these organizations, these legacy organizations that claim to represent the Jewish American community that are actually not where the median within the Jewish American community is. And then, I think what's, so one experience that I had that I would mention, going back to the Biden administration, both before and after October 7th, at times I was called upon to represent my organization in a meeting that the Biden administration was having with Jewish American communal organizations. And I was always the leftmost person in the room around the table. just allowed to be inside the room, kosher enough to be inside the room. And what was intensely frustrating to me about that was that I know that there are a lot of Jews who are to the left.
No, or yeah.
There are a substantial
Yeah.
number of Jews and Jewish organizations who, in fact, are to the left, who weren't even allowed in the door, even in a Democratic administration. And so that would create what I knew was a skewed discussion that we would be having with the administration, when instead of, representing basically the median of the Jewish community, which would be accurate, because a whole portion of the Jewish community wasn't even deemed to be kosher enough to be around the table, right? I was representing, it was as though I was on the far left, which was simply not accurate. So that's kind of giving a little bit of a sense perhaps of the landscape, but we haven't yet talked about October 7th. So, but
Well, I mean, exactly. So
Yeah.
how does October 7th, and maybe even, I think, I don't, to my mind, and you tell me if this makes sense, but I almost think of October 7th in isolation, and then the aftermath, which includes the the ongoing war, the implications, what we've seen on college campuses, the shift in politics, the shifts in the Democratic Party. I'm wondering if these numbers hold. I mean, we'll get to the sort of representation crisis in a second, because I do want to ask about it later. But let's talk about October 7th and how you see its major implications
Yeah.
for this reality that you've described.
I mean, so the repercussions, of course, have been huge in so many ways. And I do want to say that, the repercussions, first and foremost, of course, have been in Israel, Palestine itself, right? What we're dealing with here, important as it is, are still ripple effects, right? But I do want to acknowledge the fact that, Israelis suffered a horrific trauma on October 7th in terms of the heinous attacks by Hamas that day and the ongoing captivity of the hostages. And obviously what has been happening in Gaza for the last almost 2 years is absolutely appalling. And I'm sure you all know that at this point there are genocide and Holocaust experts as well as a UN commission who have come out and deem that what is happening in Gaza is in fact a genocide. So the main repercussions, obviously, since October 7th are in Israel, Palestine. Having said that, it's pretty remarkable the extent to which we have felt ripple effects here. And I feel like I do want to say one thing, which is that there were those of us who had been saying for years that the situation in Israel, Palestine could not be swept under the rug, could not be ignored, could not be allowed to just, there was no way to maintain the status quo, not even if that would have been acceptable, which it wasn't, that eventually there was going to be an explosion of some sort if the situation wasn't dealt with. And of course, that's what happened. Not that justifies what happened on October 7th in any way. I would never suggest that. But what I did not anticipate was the extent to which there would be such substantial blowback in this country in terms of our domestic politics. And so specifically in terms of the Jewish American community, let me just point to a few things that I see. One, I think over the past 2 years since October 7th, very, very close to 2 years now, there is a deep sense of fear, pain, anguish that is underlying politics within the Jewish American community. And of course, we're not alone in that. I mean, I hear absolutely, maybe a mirror image when I talk to my friends who are Arab and Muslim American and are dealing with, everything that they are coping with since October 7th as well. But I think for Jewish Americans, it is a combination of concern not only about the situation in Israel-Palestine, but also other factors that are related and not so related, like the state of liberal democracy in the United States. If you look at Jewish Americans and you look at polling both before and after October 7th, the most important issue for Jewish Americans in terms of that they think about when they are determining who to vote for is the future of democracy, right? And so you can understand, given where we are now, that there is a deep sense of concern of, in terms of the state of the country, the state of the world, where we're going. Of course, there is the issue of anti-Semitism, the sense that it is growing and that it is happening not only from the right within American politics, but a sense that is also happening on the left. And so a feeling of, that it's coming from all sides, as it were, which is obviously very, very disconcerting. So really, I feel so many people within the Jewish American community and see so many people, both, whether it's in looking at politics in Washington or what I experience when I go to my synagogue, and, people who are just clearly impacted tremendously by this, state of fear and anguish, usually for multiple reasons and not just one. So you have that on the one hand. At the same time, one thing that I had mentioned a little bit earlier is this increase in polarization and fragmentation among Jewish Americans. There was a piece in the New York Times in July that I imagine probably a lot of you have read. If you haven't read it, I do recommend it. I don't recommend everything by Ezra Klein, but this particular piece, which was called "Why American Jews No Longer Understand One Another," was really an excellent piece. And he talks about what he sees as a breakdown in every component that underlies what he sees as the Jewish American consensus. And I'm going to just read one or two sentences for you from his piece. Here's what he sees as the Jewish American consensus. What is good for Israel is good for the Jews. Anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. And there will someday soon be a two-state solution that recognizes Zionism and liberalism. So he sees those as consensus notions within the Jewish American community that have completely fragmented, fractured, no longer consensus, at least since October 7th, if not before, but certainly since October 7th. Certainly, anti-Semitism, the war in Gaza have been dramatically polarizing. I have certainly experienced, I'm sure many of you probably have as well, that there are some folks within the Jewish American community who have moved to the right since October 7th. Sometimes it will have something to do with, I know folks who have been involved in progressive movements who felt, alienated from people within progressive movements who they felt didn't give the kind of compassion to Jews that they would have expected after October 7th, or after, for example, the killings of two young Americans who were working at the Israeli embassy that happened outside the Jewish Museum, the Capitol Jewish Museum here in DC. And that has led some folks to feel alienated, some folks to move to the right. On the other hand, you have plenty of, I think, younger Jews who have just been so appalled by what they see Israel doing in the Gaza Strip that they have perhaps moved in the other direction, to the left, and not necessarily just Jews and a younger demographic. So I do think that there has been movement, a lot of anger, fragmentation, and then I would say layered on top of that, since, and this is, this is my own perspective, but since January 20th, with the Trump administration coming into office, they've adopted policies that have often furthered the fragmentation within the Jewish American community. And so let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. When the Trump administration takes action vis-a-vis universities in the name of fighting against anti-Semitism, when that is supported by some Jews and some Jewish organizations, and other Jewish Americans are intensely opposed to that, that also helps to kind of drive us apart, or can drive us apart from each other. I'll give you another example of something that came out just yesterday that is this is a pretty niche item, so I assume probably not many folks have heard about this. But yesterday, the National Endowment for the Humanities gave out its largest grant ever. Did anybody hear about this? I'm just super curious. Oh, wow, we do have somebody in the back who heard about this. All right, awesome. Big points back there. The NEH gave out its largest ever grant of over $10 million, and they gave it to an organization called the Tikva Fund. And this is a right-wing Jewish American organization that folks who are most engaged when it comes to Israeli politics, where I spend a lot of my time and focus, will perhaps know, because they are a big financial donor to the Kohelet Forum, which helped to engineer the judicial overhaul that the Netanyahu government started pushing as soon as they came to power a few years ago. So that is the largest ever donation. So the NEH has canceled, money that they gave to Jewish studies scholars all across the country to, study Yiddish and do all kinds of, cool academic projects. They canceled all of that, and money, and also other things like money going to public libraries. That's all canceled. And then they gave their biggest ever grant to the Tikva Fund, right? This sort of thing, putting your thumb on the scales when it comes to Jewish institutions, not super good for Jewish unity, right? And so that fragmentation, I think, is furthered by some of the steps taken by the Trump administration. Some other things that I would point to since October 7th. I'll just mention two more things. One is, I've noticed and this is mostly anecdotal, my perceptions from my little perch in the Jewish institutional world, in terms of the pendulum swinging back and forth a bit on in terms of where the Jewish community is on Israel-Palestine. I thought that was a really interesting moment. I experienced a very interesting moment in 2023. So the current Netanyahu government, which is, the furthest right-wing government Israel's ever had, came to power at the very end of 2022. And so through 2023, until you get to October 7th, Israeli politics was absolutely dominated by news of the Netanyahu government trying to shove through this judicial overhaul, which, could variously be called judicial reform or judicial coup or whatever, depending on what your positioning was, right? And you had hundreds of thousands of Israelis come out onto the street every Saturday protesting against the Netanyahu government, the Israeli protesting against their government. And it set up this dynamic where it was no longer clear what pro-Israel was, right? Like, are you pro-Israel if you support the Netanyahu government and the judicial overhaul? And the attempt to, as many would see it, take away the one real check and balance that exists in the Israeli political system on the power of the government. Are you pro-Israel if you only support that? Or maybe is it pro-Israel to support the protesters who are coming out onto the street, and every weekend to protest their government? And so it became more clear, I think, the state of democracy in Israel and the conflict between the government and, masses of Israeli people, that the issue of what was pro-Israel was a little bit more complicated, right? And I started to see from my perch, more people within the pro-Israel camp who had perhaps previously been more reluctant to criticize the Israeli government begin to understand that actually taking a stand in favor of Israeli democracy is the pro-Israel thing to do right now. And then October 7th happens, and it's like the snow globe just gets totally shaken up, right? That whole picture is totally shaken up, and there's more of a rally effect, right? I mean, here was this horrific attack that's committed against the people of Israel. And I think, people that kind of retrench somewhat into their corners. And now here we are 2 years in, and, where I think it's become clear to many people that any justice that there might have been to a military campaign against Hamas has long ago run its course in terms of justice, in terms of military effectiveness, in terms of strategy, in terms of anything else. And, and we're at a fundamentally kind of different stage, I think, in terms of where folks are. The last thing that is complicated, and the last thing that I want to mention is that I do think that there has been additional scrutiny of some of those legacy Jewish organizations that we've talked about a little bit. And one of the ones that I would mention here, I mean, could pick on any number, but one that I would mention is the ADL. And specifically, the line that the ADL has taken, and it's not new since October 7th, but I think the implications since October 7th and certainly under the Trump administration are very profound. The positioning by the arbiter of anti-Semitism in the Jewish community, which plays a huge role not only within our community, but speaking to everyone outside the community. The fact that that organization takes a hard line that says anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism. And groups like JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, groups like Students for Justice in Palestine are as anti-Semitic and as dangerous as the KKK is something that I think for many people within the Jewish community strikes us as not exactly where Jewish Americans in general are. So I think there's some additional scrutiny there. There was a really interesting, if folks haven't seen, I'm not doing a commercial here for the New York Times, I promise. But there was an interview that they did last month. Lulu Garcia Navarro, who does The Interview, did an interview with Jonathan Greenblatt, who has now for the past 10 years been the head of ADL. And it was, I would, love to do a deep dive into that interview with folks at some point, because it was fascinating in a number of ways.
No, thank you so much. So much to unpack there. And it's so interesting, but you're really, I think we're in a way scratching the surface, but this is such an important conversation, something we need to continue. So clearly we have a representational crisis. I'll just flag an event we did last year with, interestingly, with Ira Forman, a former envoy for combating anti-Semitism during the Obama administration, and Emily Tamkin from The Forward.
Cool.
And it was interesting because Emily talks a lot about the public opinion polling. I don't think it was Pew, but it was more recent polling. And basically, and I don't know if the numbers sort of don't matter, but gave the way she described the same split was that the legacy organizations represent about 20% or so of the population. But guess what? About 20% of the American Jewish population are very comfortable using words like genocide and apartheid. And then everyone else is somewhere in the middle. Right now, I don't know if that's oversimplifying it or not, but there's a representational crisis for sure. But this goes to me, and then of course, looking at you, well, as an academic, but also as a practitioner, as a former practitioner, and what you alluded to earlier. I mean, the word Zionism, in a way, Zionists sort of become a litmus test in some ways. For where you stand in the political debate. Is there a future for the idea of liberal Zionism? And again, I just and then as a former practitioner, as newfound academic, I feel far more comfortable in an academic setting talking about Zionism because there's a history. And it means something in a certain context. Since October 7th, I think it's become to mean something else. And it's just a question of usage in some ways. And I'm far more comfortable talking about it from a political science perspective and a historical perspective in some ways. But how do you see this, especially coming from J Street, in some way? Because I think that, and if you allow me, it's not a criticism of J Street necessarily, but I think that one of the existential issues of nation has always been, as you described it in some ways, what does it mean to be pro-Israel, right? When you don't identify at all with the government or the government's program,
right?
And especially when we're talking about, at least, we can clearly state from the perspective of the Jewish population and from the citizens of Israel, it is a democracy, right? In that respect. Now, what it how that manifests in terms of political programs in the United States. How do you see the future of a sort of liberal Zionism, if you were, or is that the right term?
Okay. I will try to keep my comments on this limited because I really do want to hear folks' questions.
That's a good way to end on, and then go to
so I'll try to, because there's a lot that could be said on this. So I really will try to keep it brief. One thing that I do because you use the word democracy, I do just have to say on that point, and speaking as a political scientist, that's a very complicated issue in terms of, if you look at how ratings or, organizations like Freedom House and VDEM and et cetera, who, look at democracy across countries all over the world, the way they always handle that question with Israel is to basically say, we are only looking at Israel within the green line, right? Sorry. The West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, different things. Never mind the fact that Israel is very clear that it intends to control those areas in perpetuity. We're still going to, right? And
I understand. I was trying to make this.
I know. Fair enough. But I would also say this. So, one thing that I want to note, just shameless self-promotion here, I do a Substack that I hope folks will check out. That's called The Debrief with Deborah Shushan. It's drshushan at .substack.com. I think I should know exactly what that is, or what it is. Actually, yes, drshushan.substack.com. And recently, so I do lots of, podcasty conversations on The Debrief. And the most recent one that I did was with one of the co-directors of an organization called Standing Together, which is a Jewish Arab shared society organization that is trying to fight for an Israel within the Green Line that will be, equal and just to all Israeli citizens, plus, fighting for a better future over the Green Line as well for Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. And talking to Rula, who is a Palestinian citizen of Israel and one of the co-directors, if you talk to her, she will tell you that she does not live in a democracy as a Palestinian citizen of Israel. So, I want to problematize that just a little bit, but that's a subject for another time.
Sure.
Your question was about liberal Zionism. And so let me just start with Brad Lander, who folks may know. Brad Lander is the comptroller in New York City. He ran for mayor recently, did not make the cut, but did not get the Democratic nomination. He ran for the Democratic nomination, but he and Zoran Mamdani, who is now the Democratic nominee for mayor of New York City, cross-endorsed each other in the primary. And he, I think, would consider himself a liberal Zionist. He believes in an Israel that is both a Jewish state and a democratic state for, all of its citizens. He's a man of, a little bit older than we are, but not much. And he likes to joke that he wants to start a family therapy practice that will be for Zionist parents, liberal Zionist parents, whose kids took their education in social justice seriously and have gone on to become anti-Zionists. So he wants to open this is a little joke. He wants to open a family therapy practice, he says, tongue in cheek. But it gives you a bit of an idea, I think, of, a dynamic that is a dynamic for liberal Zionists, where, the liberalism, right, and the Zionism are obviously in, when Zionism as it is practiced in Israel today is fundamentally illiberal, right? You have a very uncomfortable situation that over time, especially with younger Jews who are not growing up with, relatives who survived the Holocaust, who are not growing up seeing Israel as, the escape valve that we, have to maintain for Jewish safety in the same way that, our generations were. There is inevitably going to be change within the Jewish American community. And there are certainly a lot, I've certainly heard from a lot of liberal Zionist parents who have experienced this dynamic within their own communities. And unfortunately, I do think that as long as there is no possibility for a two-state solution, which, going back to Ezra Klein, the possibility of a two-state solution is what makes liberal Zionism a possibility, right? That's what, can resolve that potential conflict. If there is no future in which a two-state solution is possible, that makes things pretty dicey for liberal Zionism. But I want to mention something else. And, again, to plug the debrief with Dr. Shushan, with Deborah Shushan. Another conversation that I had recently was with Avram Borg, who I'm sure is a former speaker of Israel's Knesset. He was also, among many different positions that he's held, he headed the Jewish Agency, he headed the World Zionist Organization, and he no longer identifies as a Zionist, which was a big deal when that came out. And that goes back, a good 15 years ago or something like that. So when we spoke about Zionism, what he said is that he sees Zionism as a necessary scaffolding, to quote him, for the restructuring of the Jewish people, which ended when it accomplished its mission in 1948.
Sure.
Khalas.
Yeah.
No more Zionism. We're done. It succeeded. in its mission to establish a Jewish national home and in fact a state in the Jewish homeland, right? So
Sure.
now the question, as Avram Borg would put it, is what kind of Israel are we going to have,
Sure.
right? What is going to be the character of the state? What, is going to be the relationship of the state to all of its inhabitants and they to each other? And that is what concerns him. And frankly, that's what concerns me more than, what is the future of liberal Zionism? What I'm interested, what is going to be the future of that land between the river and the sea that I care about passionately and have devoted many years of my life to, which is, things aren't going great there right now.
Yeah.
Let me just put it that way.
No, absolutely. And I agree with you. I just think that and I agree with you, the terminology is not great. But the problem is, I think that there are other within the Jewish community, and you mentioned, JVP, and you mentioned when you are talking about issues like, the way that you are talking about Israel in terms of its continuity and its continuation and through a reform process, right? We have other Jewish organizations, right, that are not talking about it in such peaceful terms necessarily, right? And are looking at it from a different way, and that's what we get to usage,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So it's a question of these again, not very satisfactory, but Israel's right to exist, or Israel, the existence of a Jewish state versus just the end of this idea. I mean, I don't know. I know. Well, I'm just
Yeah.
saying that
Yeah.
it's I think that there is a lot of this makes sense in an academic environment where we can have this discussion, but I do think that it sort of goes to creates a bit of a dichotomy in terms of, because you are openly associating, right, the Jewish experience here with Israel, for example, right? I mean, or maybe I'm putting words.
Of Jewish Americans. I mean, for some Jewish Americans obviously have a strong attachment to
Sure.
Israel. Most have some kind of attachment, but for some of us, it's much stronger than others. I think, but let's put it this way. I mean, is it possible to be a Jewish person in the diaspora absent the state of Israel?
Sure.
It's possible,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that that's what
Yeah.
a future I'm seeking, but
I'm just so in the context of the future of an organization like J Street, for example, does can J Street exist without an association with Israel?
oh no,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not
No, I know you're not
speaking
speaking for J Street, but I'm just
Right.
looking at it as a sort of representative of what we would consider
J
science.
Street's raison d'etre is to fight for a change in US policy in a way that will be, consistent with
Mhm.
support for Israel and a liberal, democratic, equal, just future in that Israel that also extends to Palestinians
Sure.
and has some sort of, future like a two-state solution, if such a thing is possible.
But so in other words, it's still that identification.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't
absolutely.
see some of the other groups on the left as moving away from that identification, or
Some of the groups in J Street's orbit.
not
Or-
necessarily in J Street's orbit, I'm saying within the American Jewish community.
I mean, organizations that are pro-Israel in some way, I
Or-
don't
Yeah.
I don't see I haven't seen anyone, I mean,
I'm
there
talking
are
about the ones that aren't, so.
organizations like JVP or
Yeah,
if not
yeah,
now, or
exactly.
I mean, those are, they're before October 7th, they would not have considered themselves
Okay.
pro-Israel. I mean, that said, I don't mean to dismiss them. I'm not dismissing them.
Sure.
I think, and they should speak for themselves. They obviously are very capable and don't need me to speak for them. But I think, I gave the little Brad Lander spiel. I mean, a lot of those people who are activists in those organizations, grew up in homes that emphasize Jewish values, social justice, and even, Israel. And these are folks who kind of grew up and looked at their values and looked at what they were seeing in Israel Palestine and said, I'm going to become an activist in opposition to what I see on the ground.
That's,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Please, we have a few minutes. Sorry.
Hi, Dr. Shushan. Thank
Hi.
you so much for speaking
Hi.
with us.
Yeah.
I'm a senior studying government,
Oh.
I'm a minor in Jewish civilization,
Cool.
and I'm also a Jewish leader on campus. I'm co-president of the Jewish Student Association, and I want a Judaism that's divorced from Israel, and that's not a judgment on Israel. But I think to pick up on Professor Lincoln's point, groups like JVP or J Street or APAC or groups that are nominally Jewish cannot exist in a world without Israel, and that's frustrating to me as an American Jew. And so I actually think that they're making the so-called political problem worse. And so that's what has caused division on campus, and we try really hard to be a Jewish space that's open for any to anyone, regardless of your love of Israel or your hate of Israel. It doesn't matter. You should be able to be Jewish. And because of organizations like J Street, like the ones I've already mentioned, that's getting to be increasingly more difficult. So I'm sort of curious to hear your opinion on that. Is it making the situation worse? I don't know. I understand you're in a sort of precarious position as leader of J Street. I don't mean to be
Not
critical.
anymore.
That is not.
You can do it if you want. Yeah.
No, this is really interesting. I don't think and actually, and tell me your name again.
Abby, sorry.
Abby. It's nice to meet you, Abby. I have to say, I have to commend you because I hope this, I actually don't think I've heard anyone say before that they are, and I wrote down here what you said, that they would like to have a Judaism that is divorced from Israel, which is, it's fascinating to me. I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all. It's really interesting to me.
I mean that in a historical sense, I understand the connection to the land of Israel, but I mean in the modern political sense.
So in what sense? So I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
So what does that mean for you? Does it mean like I want to be able to be Jewish without having to think about or deal with, the fact that there's an Israel out there and there's this conflict that's happening, and that's I just don't want to have to deal with it one way or the other. I want to live my life being Jewish here without dealing with that.
No, and I think I'm a good example. I'm Professor Lincoln's TA. Like, I think about these issues all the time and I confront them every day, every news. That's not what I mean at all. I mean that when I'm walking down, in Red Square, right outside, I don't want people to see me wearing a Star of David and for them to think something about me.
Oh, yeah. Well, here to that. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I have my own story I can tell you later, or not story or whatever but anyway, about Stars of David. But no, I think there are many, many Jews who wish that we could, wear a Star of David or a chai or whatever without it being taken as a political statement, right, vis-a-vis Israel Palestine, but rather, just a statement about Jewish identity. Yeah, and unfortunately, that's not really possible, is it? And that's chaval. That's a shame, right? But it's true. That is. Now, I mean, I think. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, and we can talk more about this. I mean, I'm interested, and maybe you'll take my class next semester, which I think would be really interesting because we'd have a chance to talk a lot more about this. But I don't necessarily get the sense that that you're saying then that you're not interested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or impacting that in some way, but you just don't want that to shape your Judaism, your ability to wear a Star of David. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure there are plenty of folks who can identify with that. And I'll say this, I'm obviously from a different generation than you are. And when I was growing up, and I'm sure it's similar in many synagogues still today. But when I was growing up and I was in high school in the early 1990s, just to date myself a little bit here, in a conservative shul with a rabbi who was, pretty right wing on Israel, as I can understand it now. I was a high school student trying to parse this stuff at the time. It was the early 1990s, and he would, on Rosh Hashanah, he would give a sermon railing against the Republican administration that was in office at the time of George H.W. Bush over the loan guarantees. I don't know if you remember that, right? And I just remember, being in shul and being like, what the hell does this have to do with Rosh Hashanah? Like, and also, you're a rabbi, aren't you? Are you a political scientist? Like, what exactly are your credentials to be like telling me what, that railing about U.S. foreign policy on Israel, Palestine, and all of that might have had just a little bit to do with the fact that I ultimately, went on to become a specialist in Middle East politics and, work on U.S. policy on Israel, Palestine, and all of that. And also, am not particularly interested in going to shul and hearing my rabbi give a sermon about, U.S. policy on Israel, Palestine, though at the same time, I will say, given what is happening there now, do I expect my rabbi, do I expect that the teachings that I'm hearing in shul to say something that is pertinent without perhaps making policy prescriptions to where we should be as Jews? Yes, I do. So this stuff is, it's complicated.
Please join me in thanking Deborah Shushan.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's really my pleasure.